Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And here on Fridays, I normally call my videos Responding to the Critics. I've been involved in responding to a book by my friend Steve Gregg entitled Why Not Full Preterism? And this is video number 29. I'm not going to extend this an awful lot further. As I mentioned to you, I'm not going to cover every single issue that Steve raises. There's no need to. For instance, the last couple of videos have covered Steve's beliefs concerning the Adamic death, and therefore that leads directly into the issue of the resurrection. By showing that Steve's view of the Adamic death is flawed, that means his view of resurrection is flawed. Now, it's very, very important that not only do I show you that the foundations of his doctrine is false concerning the resurrection, let me illustrate how he contradicts himself in this book, even in regard to that. Okay? Last week, I pointed out that Steve denies that there is in the Old Testament, basically that would mean there is no such thing in the New. He denies that there is such a thing as sin death or covenantal death. Well, that's on page 157 of his book. When one is willing, and I'm reading, when one is willing to reinvent the very doctrine of the atonement by appeal to something like Christ's spiritual death or his shedding of spiritual blood, one might be expected to provide an impressive scriptural case. Now, I want to point out right here, I'm not going to discuss it except to make a note or two on it, all right? Steve says, an appeal to spiritual death. Well, Christ, quote, took our sins upon himself on the cross, 2 Peter chapter 2. By taking our sin on him, that means that Christ died spiritually. That doesn't mean his spirit died. That means that he was alienated from the Father, separated from the Father, and thus his words, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, I know a lot of people say, well, that doesn't mean that the Father had actually forsaken him. Well, that's what the words mean, and they are from Psalms chapter 22, and in the context, that's exactly what David meant, even though David knew that the abandonment was temporary. Pardon me. And so it is an assertion of the reality of abandonment, even though couched in a context that stated vindication was coming. Well, if vindication is coming, then the abandonment was real, not imaginary. One commentator that I read on this, and I don't want to get sidetracked too much, said Jesus thought he had been abandoned when he really hadn't. Seriously. Wow. So anyway, he says that preterists hold to the shedding of spiritual blood. Well, there may be a few out there that take that. I certainly do not. Jesus shed his physical blood. So this is another example of Steve in his book presenting a misrepresentation. A significant number of preterists, so far as I'm aware, simply do not take the position that he shed spiritual blood. So why does Steve choose to do that? That's the question. But to continue, however, we search in vain for any reference in Scripture, even to Christ ever having died a spiritual death. The term, as far as I can tell, the concept is entirely absent from the Bible. So he's saying spiritual death is absent from the Bible. It should tell us a lot about a teacher when he contorts a major tenet of the Christian faith by appeal to a supposedly comprehensive controlling idea that is nowhere found in the scripture. So, according to Steve, the idea of spiritual death, covenantal death, since the term is not found, then the idea is not found. This is the negative fallacy, missing word, different word, hermeneutic. By the way, in my upcoming book, once it is ever finished, I have an extensive study of how Steve, in this book, over and over and over and over again, appeals to the missing word, different word hermeneutic. Well, for instance, this passage cannot be the same as this passage because this passage does not mention what this passage did. Logical fallacy. Now, in the book, he says, and he calls attention to the fact that during our debate in Denver, that I accused him of doing that, and he says, I would never use that hermeneutic. Yet again, in my upcoming book entitled Resurrection Feast Fulfilled, an examination of Sukkot, Israel's last feast days, and its relationship to the resurrection, I document 6 or 7 major arguments made by Steve in which he appeals directly to the fact this verse mentions the following tenets. This verse over here doesn't, therefore this verse is different. Speaks of a different time and place. It's a false hermeneutic. So here was Steve on page, what was that again? 157, saying there's no such thing as spiritual death because the term is never found. On page 158, he says, while it is true that in certain contexts, the words dead and death are used metaphorically of the sinner's lost condition, it is clear that the remedy to that condition was realized by the sinners coming to Christ, not by Christ coming in judgment on Jerusalem. So, on the one hand, he tells us there is no such thing as spiritual death, covenantal death, which is a metaphorical reference to death. And on the other hand, he says, well, it's certainly true that death is referred to metaphorically. Well, I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, that's a contradiction. It's untenable to make that argument. Now, I want to make a point here. And like I said, I'm going to be covering several different issues. I will say this, that Steve calls into question the idea of a literal rapture in AD 70. Well, on this, we are in agreement. In my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings, I have an extensive discussion of the theory that there was a literal rapture in AD 70. I don't know of anyone that's written such an extensive review and refutation of that doctrine. Now, don't forget, for the month of August 2023, U.S. orders only, I have this book and this book, Resurrection of Daniel, chapter 12, Future, Fulfilled or Future, and regularly they would cost you $57, but for the rest of August 2023, U.S. orders only, total delivered price, $45. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com, and click on the tab right up at the very top. You can't miss it. Beautiful tab, beautiful banner up there. Okay, so I agree fully with Steve Gregg that there was not a literal, I'll use the term physical, resurrection or rapture in AD 70. Now, I use the word physical. That is not a term that those who hold to the AD 70 theory use. They believe that the bodies were instantly transformed, although no physical bodies were taken out of the grave. That's a conundrum. So, for the rest of this video, I want to focus on several points that Steve makes, 4 points. I don't know if I'll get to them at all. I'll do my very best. In his conclusion, to call into question the preterist view of resurrection. Now, listen, folks, let me recommend that you watch last week's video and the week before that video that Mike Sullivan and I have done in our response to Doug Wilson, in which we discuss the nature, the definition of resurrection seen from the perspective of the Old Testament prophecies cited by the New Testament writers when they discuss resurrection. Okay? But Steve literally actually believes, that at the end of time, the end of the Christian age, every human being who has ever died and decomposed, they've gone into the sea, eaten by the fish, they've gone into the dust and decomposed, will be raised out of the dust or out of the water, recomposed. I'm not going to go into the philosophical problems of that, but just think about it. It's difficult to conceive. I know that Chrysostom wrote a response to that problem years and years and years ago, centuries ago. I don't find his arguments convincing, but be that as it may. Okay. So Steve summarizes his arguments against the preterist view of resurrection on pages 165 and following. Point number 1. The final resurrection is supposed to be the final vindication and glorification of the church, the end of our affliction. Now notice, the end of our afflictions and persecutions. However, after AD 70, the church entered centuries of far worse persecution than what the apostles suffered under the Jews. Also, the church did not become more glorious, but descended into corrupted, dead institutionalism. It is hard to name one factor that improved in the spiritual life or earthly circumstances of the church in or around AD 70. I must say, I'm not going to be able to cover all this. Steve says the resurrection is supposed to be our, that is the churches, the modern churches, final vindication and glorification. Well, let's focus on the concept of vindication first. You see, throughout the New Testament, we find that, number one, the reality that the church was being persecuted. Now, I know that Steve wants to deny that persecution was carried on by the Jews. He objects to this in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, 14 to 16, where Paul said that the, quote, fellow countrymen of the Thessalonians were persecuting them. And Steve says, well, the fellow countrymen of the Thessalonians were not the Jews. So we're supposed to believe, according to Steve, that even though Jews lived in Thessalonica, were citizens there, and therefore they were the fellow citizens of the Christians. You know, they came out of the synagogue just like the Christians did, the Jews who were converted. And even though it's them, the Jews, who stirred up the multitudes to persecute the church, we're not supposed to hold the Jews responsible. We're supposed to ignore the fact that later on in Acts chapter 17, when Paul was at Berea, guess what? The Jews from Thessalonica went there and stirred up the multitudes to persecute Paul there as well. But according to Steve, we're not supposed to focus on the Jews, even though they were the movers and the shakers and the instigators of the Jews. As N.T. Wright said, and as Johann Munk, a long time ago, as Adolf Harnack said some time ago, unless the evidence is misleading, persecution against the church did not arise among pagans. It arose from within Judaism, and Paul is the best example that we have of that, otherwise known as Saul at the time. So we have the indisputable fact, historical fact, that persecution against the church began, and it sprang from the Jews, and it continued from the Jews, even though Nero persecuted the church, the Neronian persecution of 67 to 70. somewhere along in there. That persecution was instigated by the Jews, ladies and gentlemen. Nero's entire inner circle of counselors and advisors were all Jews. There was an embassage from Jerusalem in Rome to try to get Nero to kill Paul. So who instigated Nero to kill Christians? The Jews. So once again, we have the fact, historical fact, that it was the Jews who instigated and carried on, or even used pagans to persecute the church. Point number 2, vindication for that first century persecution at the hand of the Jews is the focus of the promise of vindication of the church. Does the Bible say that there would be persecution after that first century persecution? Well, it indicates it, implies it. Revelation chapter 14, verse 13, blessed are those who die in the Lord from henceforth. Yea, says the Spirit, they shall rest from their labors. Now that doesn't demand persecution, but the context is persecution by Babylon. But the context is the coming of the Lord, and the Spirit says, from henceforth, that is after the day of the Lord, blessed are those who die in the Lord. But the point is, this is the critical point. The promise of vindication was the promise that was coming in that generation, ladies and gentlemen. Matthew chapter 23. Jesus pointed to the Jews, the hostile Jews, as he stood in the temple. And he says, you bear witness that you are the sons of those who killed the prophets, because you say, well, if we'd have been alive in the days of the prophets, we would not have slain the prophets. You thereby bear witness to yourselves that you are the sons of those who killed the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Now I want to ask you to consider this, ladies and gentlemen. There is nowhere in the Bible in which God ever spoke of a time beyond that generation in which the filling up of the measure of sin by killing God's saints would be filled up and judgment would fall. Not one single place. So in Matthew chapter 23, when Jesus speaks to the Jews of that generation standing in the temple with him, he said, fill up the measure of your father's sin. Behold, I send to you apostles, prophets, and wise men. Some of them you shall scourge, chase from city to city. Now watch, that upon you may come all of the blood of all of the righteous shed upon the earth. From righteous Abel unto Zacharias, son of Barachias, whom you slew between the temple and the altar. Now watch. Verily I say unto you, all of these things shall come upon this generation. Jesus did not say, oh, well, it's going to be repeated over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. The filling up of the measure of sin on the part of Israel was going to take place in that generation, and that generation is the church. The church of that generation is the church that was going to be vindicated at the second coming of Christ. Now, I don't have time to go into that in depth, but let me recommend again my 2 books. These 2 books cover the doctrine of the vindication of the martyrs extensively and in depth. Pay attention to this. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, 14 to 16, Paul said that the Jews were persecuting the saints at that time. They had killed the prophets. By the way, no future generation has ever killed an Old Testament prophet. They have slain the Lord. No future generation is or can be guilty of killing Jesus. And they are killing us, the apostles and prophets, so as to fill up the measure of their sin, and the wrath of God has come upon them to the uttermost. Folks, Paul is reiterating Jesus' teaching, explicitly. Who is he accusing of filling up the measure of their sin? The Jews. Who is to bear the brunt of the wrath of God? The Jews. Revelation. This great city, the great harlot city, Babylon, was holding a cup, Revelation chapter 17, verse 6, full of the blood of the saints and of the martyrs of Jesus. And it was that city, Babylon, that was to be destroyed at the coming of the Lord, the second coming, the parousia of the Lord. And it was to come quickly. You do realize, don't you, that Steve Gregg agrees that the book of Revelation is primarily about the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, he wants to leave that behind in Revelation chapter 20 in discussions of the millennium, which is anachronistic, because the judgment is at the end of the millennium. The rewarding is at the end of the millennium. And Jesus said, Revelation chapter 22, verse 12, behold, I come quickly, and my reward, my reward, that's the judgment of the dead. That's the judgment of the living. The dead go into the lake of fire. Guess what? The living and the dead enter into the New Jerusalem. Behold, I come quickly. My reward is with me to give to every man according to his works. No indication of a yet future time of vindication. It was to be at the coming of the Lord in the judgment of the city Babylon, which is the city where the Lord was crucified. And then notice again, that's enough on that. The point, I got to mention one other thing. Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 9 and 10, Paul said, I reckon, and that word reckon there doesn't mean Paul was from the South. It means I logically deduce. I have decided logically. Listen to me. I believe it was Johann Monk who said, Paul was either the most significant eschatological figure in the New Testament other than Jesus, or he was a maniacal egomaniac. Why did he say that? Because Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 that basically he was on an equal par with Moses because he was delivering the new covenant, just like Moses delivered the first. And he said that because in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, 9 and 10, Paul said, I reckon that God has set forth us, the apostles, last of all, as men condemned to die. Now, wait a minute. Folks, you catch the power of that? Here is Paul saying that God had set forth the apostles as the last to die. Now, this language and this imagery, God has set forth us, the apostles last of all, is taken from the Roman world in which a Roman general, military leader, emperor, goes off to war. He conquers his enemies. He captures his enemies. He captures the king, captures the generals, captures the leading citizens. And he would be given, on his return, would be given what they called a triumph. And a triumph was they would march all of the things that they had captured, stolen, looted, wagon load after wagon load after wagon load of gold and silver, precious garments, and etc. They would be in a train. They would be in a parade. And here they are, they go through. Then they would start marching through all of the captives, men and women who have now been taken captive, who are going to be slaves, or they're going to be killed. And last of all, in the chain, would be the king or the governors or the most prominent of the men that they had conquered and captured and taken captive. And in Roman custom, they would very often take 1 out of 10 of every person in that parade and would take them up to the Capitoline, and there's a big bluff, hundreds of feet drop off, and they'd throw them off. Guess what? The king that had been taken captive, thrown off, killed. He and his entourage were the last to be killed. Now, was Paul so naive? Was Paul so ignorant? Was Paul so maniacally egotistical as to believe no one would die after him and the other apostles? No. Paul was talking about filling up the measure of the suffering on the part of the saints, and he said himself in Colossians chapter 1, 23 and following, and now rejoice in my sufferings on you, and I fill up in my flesh that which is lacking in the afflictions of Christ, and I fill up that which, let me say that again, I fill up that which is lacking in the afflictions of Christ. Dunn and O'Brien and a host of other scholars. N.T. Wright. Take note of the fact that Paul was saying, and by the way, the language, the Greek is in the emphatic mode. What does that mean? Paul was saying, I am filling up in my flesh that which is lacking in the afflictions of Christ. Paul was saying, I personally. Well, 1 Corinthians 4:9 says, I and the other apostles. Paul said, I and the other apostles are the very ones responsible for the final filling up of the measure of suffering and sin on the part of Israel for persecuting them, and vengeance, wrath, vindication was coming in that generation. Matthew 23, Revelation. Luke 18. Jesus foretold that his apostles were going to be persecuted, and he told them to pray without ceasing. And he said, be like the woman who went to the judge of a certain city and said, avenge me on my adversary. The word avenge there is from the Greek word ekdekesis, avenge. And at first he wouldn't, but she kept coming back and coming back and coming back. And finally the judge says, I don't fear God and I don't fear man, but this woman just won't let up on it. Therefore I will avenge her. And God says, Jesus said, will not God avenge his elect? Now he's talking about the apostles, that generation. Will not God avenge his elect who cry out to him day and night? Yes, verily, he will avenge them speedily. Now that's from the Greek term, intakai. Some former preterists argue, amazingly, and let me be very blunt, dishonestly. And they say, well, intakai has to do with the rapidity of actions, not the imminence of actions. That is blatantly false. Intakai is only used about 7 or 8 times in the New Testament. It never refers to the rapidity of action as opposed to the imminence of action. I won't take the time, don't have the time to demonstrate that today because I'm out of time. Hey, thank you for joining me for this morning's morning musing. I still don't know if I'm going to be able to film with Mike or not. I'm still having some difficulties with my technology. So far, so good. So, thank you. I hope I'm able to join you tomorrow on Preterist Apologetics. We'll wait and see. In the meantime, have a fantastic weekend.